Now, as all of our presenters emphasized, whether it's on the panel or the speakers, a city is only as great as the communities that it creates. It's not just how we talk to one another. It's not just how we work with one another. It's what is key is how we understand or try and understand one another and help each other. And it's an ever-evolving job to make this happen. Now, it's particularly challenging, of course, in large metropolitan areas where millions of us live. Toronto has the great good fortune to have a man who's on the cutting edge of building community and indeed, in my view, happiness in this metropolis. Would you please welcome our next speaker, Rahul Bhardwaj, who's the President and CEO of the Toronto Community Foundation. Rahul.
Morning. David, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Great to be here. Great to be the person that takes you into the break today. So over the next couple of minutes, I'm going to try and stretch our thinking a little bit. Not to suggest it hasn't been stretched already, but let's see where we can take it a little bit further. And what I'm going to do is take you through a little bit of a tour of Toronto and introduce you to parts that you know about, hopefully introduce you to parts you may not know about. And you're going to take that tour from the comfort of your own seats. We're going to go through the Toronto's Vital Signs Report at a very, very high level. Now, for those of you who may not know about the report, it's something that we put out annually through the Toronto Community Foundation. And for those who may not know the foundation all that well, just think about us as we're the foundation for people who love Toronto and want to make it great. One of the really good things we do each year is the report. Hundreds of reports are aggregated. It's online, and we do a section with one of the leading newspapers in Toronto, the Toronto Star, where we're happy to share it with the public. It's a story about Toronto, for Toronto. Then we connect it with solutions and philanthropy to, as David noted, to expand the city and strengthen our communities. But every year when we do the report, John Cruikshank and his crew, these really smart journalists, they want to peg me to the wall and they say, give it to us in a snapshot. What's the sound bite about what's going on in Toronto? I want to tell you a little bit of a story about how I got to this year's soundbite. When I first moved to Toronto from London, Ontario, where I grew up, I came to Toronto and I went to University of Toronto and I walked through the hall of the college I started. And the first day I go there, I walk through and I run by somebody and I say to him, so how's it going? Now, if you go to England and you say to somebody, how's it going? What do you get? Jolly good. You go to the States? Awesome. What did I get? Not too bad. So it really struck me, not too bad. What are we driving at here? Is this a little bad? A little good? It took me about 25 years for me to really get a handle on what does it mean for Toronto to be not too bad. So this year, when we looked at what's going on in the Vital Signs Report that looks at the good, the not so good, and where we can go, nothing pulled it together quite as the notion as Toronto not too bad. So let's parse that though. What does Toronto not too bad mean? Well, look, we're sound, we're safe, but we're struggling. So let's look at those a little bit. When we say we're sound, what does that really mean? Well, according to The Economist, we're the fourth most livable city on the planet. And when you look at all the good lists you want to be on, Toronto is right up there at the top. So we've got something really proud to be on. Now, another interesting thing, if you didn't know this, The Economist on that list, 3 out of the top 5 cities on the planet are all Canadian. Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto. And as much as it pains me to talk about hockey right now, if you think about it, if this were hockey, we would have 3 players on the first all-star team on the planet. And that's something we should think about and celebrate a lot more in Canada. So there are a whole bunch of reasons we're sound, but I thought livability is a really key piece. Safe. So every year somebody says to me, what is the single piece of evidence that jumped out at you that surprised you this year? And it had to be safety. Now, in all fairness to the media, if you live in this city, don't watch too much TV. You think we're going to where in a handbasket. It's a very dangerous thing to do. And I don't want to deny the fact that we've got some real issues on violence in our cities, in particular communities. But in 2011, crime was down 5% from the year before, over 35% in 5 years. This is a remarkable thing. We have a very safe metropolis. I want to touch on the homicide rate for a second. So in 2011, we had 42 homicides in Toronto. That's terribly disturbing. But what's our average? 63. So when you think about it from that perspective, we're actually a lot lower, and that's a good trend to support. Here's a little bit of a comparator, though. When we look south of the border, and we look at a city that's just like us, we typically look at Chicago. Now, it's a strange way to look at this, but Chicago had a banner year for homicides in 2011, if you can actually say that. It was low. Toronto, 42, average 63, Chicago, 423. Go figure. So we are both sound, in my view, quite safe, but here comes the struggling piece. You've heard it alluded to before a little early when Mary and John Cruikshank were talking about a divided city, and David Holchansky's name came out. I want to give you a quick picture on what David talked about is the emerging nature of this city. And the story I'm going to tell you is actually from about 1970 to 2005. I'm going to get out of the glare here for a second. Now I can see you better. So between 1970 and 2005. In 1970, 2/3 of all neighborhoods in the city of Toronto were middle income. Take that to 2005, that 2/3 has now become 29%. Where did the middle class go? Did not move to the 905, trust me. The story I'm going to tell you is playing out in the 905 as well. At the same time, the high and the very high income neighborhoods went from 7% of the whole and doubled to about 15% of the whole. And you know what the rest is going to look like? The low and the very low income neighborhoods, they more than doubled. They went from over 20% or just around 20 to over 40%. Right now in the city of Toronto, we've got 43% of Torontonians. Do the math. That's over 1 million people living in low and very low income neighborhoods, 2/3 of which are visible minorities. Once again, that's what John Cruikshank was talking about. It gets covered a lot in the city, but we're not really that sensitized to it. Let's think ahead for a moment, though, and say, all right, if that was the type of change we experienced over the last 35 years, what are we looking at in the future? Well, David's projections are that by 2025, 60% of the city of Toronto will live in low or very low income neighborhoods. That's a remarkable number, and perhaps that's the crisis or the tipping point we need to really cajole leadership in this city. But let's talk a little bit more about the change in big pictures. We've got the equivalent of Montreal moving into the Toronto region over the next 20 years. We're going to have more seniors than youth. And soon we're going to have close to 80% of the city of Toronto either being immigrant or children of immigrants. Wow, that's a lot of change. So it begs the question, what are the solutions that we can look at moving forward when we're thinking about managing, or should I say, leading through that change? Well, you heard a couple this morning. Leadership, absolutely, front and center. How about our physical infrastructure? Absolutely. We've got sewers and water mains that are over 100 years old in Toronto. So either you pay me a lot now, or you're going to pay a way more later. So we've got to get onto that. How about our social infrastructure, affordable housing, youth unemployment, all very key elements. And as you heard on the earlier panel as well, governance, right? That word that makes our eyes roll back. When you've got about 90 cents out of every tax dollar of this city going to the province and the federal government, and then we have to hope that we can get it back, I'd put it out there that we've got a 21st century city with an 1867 governance system. There's an enormous disconnect going on here. But we know all this stuff already. And when we went back at the Community Foundation and looked at this, we said, you know what? One of the implicit assumptions in all of this is, if we get those pieces right, we will become a more global city and a more prosperous city. Then we said, you know what, though? Between that 1970 and 2005, we had an enormous amount of prosperity undergoing in the city, and at the same time, an enormous amount of inequality that we created. What gives? Then the obvious. Well, maybe prosperity isn't the ultimate. Maybe prosperity is in fact the penultimate goal here, which begs the question, what's the ultimate goal? So we went looking around, and guess what? Happiness. Happiness is what came to the forefront. And don't laugh, this is a serious matter now. So we went back, we looked at Bhutan in 1972 goes from gross domestic product to gross happiness product. And the world said, isn't that quaint? It's Bhutan. But we've actually progressed since then. Jeffrey Sachs, world-renowned economist, takes this to the United Nations. You've got unanimity. People are saying this is really important. We've got Derek Bach from the former president of University of Harvard. He's writing books about this and policies about, guess what? How to get people into a place of happiness. So what does that mean for the city of Toronto? Talked a little bit about vision earlier, and at the Community Foundation we said, well listen, what would a vision around a happy city of Toronto look like? So that's where I want to put up for you briefly. So for us, a happy city could be a city that moves, a city that works, and a city that lives. So let's parse those a little bit, because they each have two parts to it. So the city that moves, no kidding, transit, right? It's the circulatory system of the city and the region. We've got to get that piece right. And as you've heard earlier, it's also the connective tissue for pulling together this emerging and divided city. Really, really important. How about the other part of a city that moves? We can be a city that moves other cities to a greater level of leadership. And what do I mean by that? Well, 2 years ago, our not too bad equivalent was that the world needs Toronto to succeed. That's what we went public with in the Star in our editorial piece. Why there? Because Toronto is the petri dish for globalization on the planet. This is where it's playing itself out. And you know what? Sure, we're not getting it perfect, but we're doing an awfully good job in some important areas. We have people from around the world coming here to say, how do you do it so well? And at the Community Foundation, our plea back to Torontonians was, please, if we're too cheap to fix this city for ourselves, can we please do it for the rest of the world? Because they need a demonstration of leadership. So that's how we can be a city that moves. How about a city that works? Well, despite the foibles, or should I say substantial foibles, and gong show from time to time down at City Hall, we're still the fourth most livable city in the world. So guess what? It does work. The city does work. We've got a great city bureaucracy that's pulling together a huge city for some pretty cool things. Now we need to celebrate that when it's working, and frankly, we need to speak more about trusting our political leadership and find a way to have a constructive dialogue about that. The other part of a city that works should be the obvious one when I think about work. It's what you go to do every day. If we're serious about getting the best and the brightest talent to come to Canada, we need to be thinking about labor market integration in a way that you don't end up with 2/3 of visible minorities living in low and very low income neighborhoods. We just got to do a much better job at that. And I might add, not just because we need good units of labor, but we need to set the foundation for citizenship for this country for a long time now. So we need to build good citizens and make that a real opportunity. How about the city that lives? Once again, 2 points. Sustainability. You can't have a living city unless you're sustainable. And without getting into great depth, at least in Toronto, we're moving in the right direction. You know, whether it's blue flags or green roofs, it's a part of our DNA. At least it's becoming that. How about the other part of a city that lives? City that lives is a city that knows how to live it up. And we should be celebrating that more. We've got fantastic restaurants, museums, theaters, and folks, we're sitting in TIFF. The world's best film festival is here in Toronto. We need to continue to invest in that and celebrate it because it's great. And you know what? It makes us very, very happy as a city. So we thought about it and we said prosperity is extremely important, but what if we liberated our thinking? And what if we actually introduced the phrase happiness or building a happy city into Toronto, and maybe that can be a long-term beacon to think about. I want to leave you with a last little story, the one that sort of brought this home to me. Winston Churchill, right, Prime Minister of Britain during World War II. So as the story goes, in the midst of all of the war, his cabinet came to him and they said, Prime Minister, we're running out of money. We need to cut funding somewhere so we can build more armaments and bullets. And he said, great, go away, think about it, come on back and give me a pitch me on it. So they come back and they say, Prime Minister, we must cut funding to the arts. Now, when I first heard this story, I thought, can you believe it? They're actually funding the arts while their city's being bombed. But they were. So what was Churchill's response to cut the funding to the arts? He said, then what are we doing this for? So I put it out to say to Torontonians, why don't we ask ourselves that deliciously existential question of what are we doing this for? And maybe an answer can be, at the end of the day, building a happy city for a change. Thanks for your time this morning, folks. I've really enjoyed it and hope to spend the rest of the day with you.